Imagine this. You're watching a heart-wrenching movie scene. Around you, sniffles, echo, and tissues are being passed around. But one person sits there, dry-eyed, calm, maybe even munching popcorn. No tears, no quiver in the chin. At a funeral, while everyone else is sobbing, that same person might stand stoic and composed. It's almost eerie, right? You might wonder, are they made of stone? Do they feel anything at all? It's easy to slap on labels: cold, unfeeling, maybe even, are they a psychopath or something? We tend to assume that if someone never cries, something must be wrong. Either they're heartless or broken, or trying way too hard to play the tough guy. But hold that thought, because that assumption is likely off base. What if not crying isn't a sign of emptiness or cruelty at all, but a clue to a different psychological profile? In fact, those perpetually dry eyes can reveal a lot about how a person's mind works. It's not that they're simply too cool for emotions, or that they're performing stoicism as some kind of stunt. More often, their resistance to tears is a genuine reflection of how they process feelings under the hood. The truth is, their lack of tears isn't a performance. It's a powerful signal about how they're wired emotionally. It's like they've solved a psychological equation most of us are still grappling with, finding another way to cope with feelings that doesn't involve crying. Let's unravel this equation piece by piece, and explore the psychology of people who, almost, never cry. Emotional suppression versus regulation. Bottling it up, or just handling it. First off, consider the role of emotional suppression. Some people do feel intense emotions, but make a deliberate or unconscious choice not to cry. Why would anyone do that? Well, perhaps they learned early on that tears have consequences. Maybe as a kid they were told, stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. So they trained themselves to choke back the sobs. Over time, this can become an automatic reflex. Feel the lump in the throat, but swallow it down. These are the people who might blink rapidly and clear their throat when they're upset, fighting to keep those tears from escaping. They've essentially built an emotional dam. Psychologists distinguish suppression, consciously holding back feelings, and repression, unconsciously blocking emotions. In the case of chronic non-criers, both can be at play. They might intentionally tense up to stop tears, or they might have unconsciously buried their softer emotions so deeply that crying isn't even an option anymore. In the moment, this can seem like strength or self-control. No breakdowns here, thank you very much. But there's a catch. Bottling up emotions can carry a cost. Research suggests that routinely suppressing your emotional expressions can backfire on your health. You may keep a poker face, but inside, your stress physiology goes haywire. In fact, one study indicated that people who habitually push down emotions have higher stress levels and even an increased risk of earlier death. Yikes. So, never crying might feel like staying in control, but it could be silently ramping up your blood pressure or gnawing at your well-being. Now, contrast that with emotional regulation. Not everyone who rarely cries is actively suppressing something. Some folks have simply found other ways to process feelings. They still feel sad or hurt, but instead of sobbing, maybe they journal about it or talk it out calmly or throw themselves into solving the problem at hand. For these people, not crying isn't about avoidance. It's about coping through different outlets. They might say, yeah, I was really upset, but I went for a long run and I felt better after. They achieve the same emotional relief that a crying spell might offer, but through an alternative route. Think of it like this. Tears are one of the body's built-in stress relief valves. When we cry, our bodies release a mix of neurochemicals, including endorphins and oxytocin, that actually help us calm down and ease pain. It's one reason a good cry can feel so cathartic. You literally get a wash of soothing hormones that can lift your mood afterwards. People who don't cry might be missing that particular mechanism, but they often develop other self-soothing mechanisms. Some practice mindfulness or distraction or use humor to diffuse their sadness. In a sense, they regulate rather than vent. And if it's done in a healthy way, that's not necessarily a bad thing at all. In fact, mental health experts say that being able to tolerate and manage distress without always melting down is a useful skill. The key difference is choice and awareness. A healthy non-crier is processing their emotions, just without tears, whereas a suppressing non-crier is just shoving feelings into a corner and locking the door, which, as we noted, can come back to bite them later. So if you meet someone who never cries, one question is, are they dealing with their emotions in other ways, or are they just burying them? The former might indicate resilience or emotional skill. The latter might signal fear of vulnerability or learned emotional shutdown. And figuring out which is which can be tricky from the outside. It requires understanding that person's context and history, which we'll get into. Wired a bit differently, personality traits of the tearless. Another big piece of this puzzle is personality. Some people are, quite simply, less prone to crying because of how they're wired emotionally. Consider the trait of neuroticism in personality psychology, which, despite the name, basically means how easily and intensely you experience negative emotions like anxiety, sadness, and anger. People high in neuroticism get emotional more often. Those low in it are more even-keeled. Studies have repeatedly found that high neuroticism goes hand in hand with crying more frequently. So it makes sense that the folks on the opposite end, low neuroticism, aka high emotional stability, might rarely cry. It's not that they're robots, they do have feelings, but the volume knob on those feelings is turned down a bit. They don't get overwhelmed as easily. Your world could be falling apart and they'll be like, okay, let's think this through, with dry eyes and a steady voice. Internally they're sad, but not so intensely sad that it triggers tears. In a way, their baseline emotional setting is just cooler and calmer. Closely related is conscientiousness, another personality trait. This one is about discipline, self-control, and doing the proper thing. Highly conscientious people often pride themselves on keeping it together. If you value self-control highly, you might clamp down on visible emotion as a matter of principle. Picture a very disciplined, by-the-book individual, the kind who feels it's important to appear composed, perhaps believing there's no use crying over spilled milk as a life motto. This mindset can make someone reluctant to cry or even feel ashamed to cry, resulting in, again, very few tears shed over time. While research hasn't strongly linked conscientiousness to crying frequency in the way neuroticism is linked, it's plausible that a person who scores off the charts in conscientiousness might enforce an unofficial no crying rule on themselves. It's like an internal stoic code. Emotions under check, always. They'll find other ways to deal because crying might feel like losing control, and if there's one thing conscientious folks hate, it's feeling out of control. Then we have a more unusual trait, alexithymia. If you haven't heard that word, it's a fancy Greek-derived term essentially meaning no words for feelings. People with alexithymia aren't cold on purpose, rather, they genuinely struggle to identify and articulate what they're feeling. It's like there's a disconnect between the emotional brain and the conscious mind. Someone with a high level of alexithymia might, for example, feel their heart pounding or get a headache, but not connect it to I'm upset or I'm sad. They know something's up physically but can't label it as an emotion. How does this relate to crying? Well, if you can't quite recognize your own sadness or frustration, you're less likely to respond to it with tears. Indeed, people with alexithymia can cry, but many report that it happens rarely for them. They might sit through a sad movie intellectually understanding that it's tragic, but not feeling the sorrow deeply or specifically enough to tear up. Or they experience a personal loss and instead of crying, they just feel numb confusion. Alexithymia can stem from various things, sometimes trauma, sometimes even certain neurological conditions. But the result is an emotional profile that's often flat. If you have a friend who never cries and also often seems a bit detached or in their head, alexithymia could be one explanation. They're not choosing not to cry. They literally don't fully feel what others feel in a way that triggers tears. It's worth noting this condition can cause interpersonal issues, since it might come off as lack of empathy, though internally the person might care without knowing how to show it. Speaking of empathy, here's a twist. Not crying could correlate with lower empathy in some people. Empathy, feeling others' emotions, often can bring a person to tears at someone else's pain or even joy. So if someone seldom cries, even when others might, it might mean they aren't feeling that same surge of empathy. This isn't a given, but research backs it up. A study comparing normal criers to people who rarely or never cry found that the non-criers scored lower on empathy. They also reported feeling less moved by emotional stimuli in general. Now, does that mean every non-crier lacks empathy? Absolutely not. Human psychology is never that simple, but it's one potential factor. Some individuals are naturally more analytical, even in emotional situations. Instead of emotionally resonating and tearing up when their friend shares a heartbreak, they might go into problem-solving mode, or they might care in a more distant, intellectualized way. They care, but they might not ache in sync with the other person. Hence, no tears. Again, personality factors like being highly introverted or thinking-oriented can play a role too. Some people live more in their thoughts than feelings, and while they might be very loyal and loving, they just don't express it with emotional displays. So between emotional stability, low neuroticism, a controlled, harsh, stoic disposition, possibly linked to conscientiousness, and traits like alexithymia, difficulty feeling, expressing emotion, you can see how certain personalities are just not built for crying. They've got a different emotional operating system, and importantly to them, this usually doesn't feel like a loss. Many non-criers will tell you, "I'm not really the crying type, I handle things differently," and they're okay with that. In fact, one interesting finding, despite all the differences in empathy and attachment we'll discuss, overall well-being, general happiness or life satisfaction, tends to be just as high in people who never cry as in those who cry easily. In other words, not crying doesn't necessarily mean someone is miserable or suffering inside. Often they're fine. They've adjusted to their emotional style. This surprises many people because we assume if you don't cry, you're not releasing sadness and therefore must feel worse. But research didn't find lower well-being in non-criers on average. It's a nice reminder that everyone's emotional equilibrium is different. You can be a happy person who just doesn't cry much. Culture and gender. Big boys don't cry, and other lies we learn. Now we can't talk about crying without talking about societal expectations. Culture with a capital C. It's huge. From childhood, many of us are trained on when and whether crying is acceptable. There's the classic, big boys don't cry. Little girls might hear, don't be a crybaby. Certain cultures or family traditions preach a stiff upper lip, where any show of tears is considered weakness or self-indulgence. If you grow up in that environment, you quickly learn to feel embarrassed or ashamed of crying, even when you're alone. This conditioning can run deep. By the time that kid grows up, not crying is almost an automatic reflex. Not because they don't feel, but because at a gut level, they believe, I shouldn't cry. Gender stereotypes amplify this. Boys and men, in particular, get the message that crying will make them seem weak or not manly. Many men who rarely cry will tell you the last time they shed tears was maybe as a small child, and then they force themselves to stop because they got ridiculed or scolded. Decades of hearing phrases like man up and crying is for girls build a pretty tough shell. By adulthood, it might not even be a conscious choice. Their brain just slams the brakes on tears before they can even well up. Interestingly, this conditioning shows up in statistics. Surveys and studies consistently find that women cry more often than men, and for longer durations on average. It's not just because of biology, though biology plays a role, which we'll get to next. It's heavily influenced by these social norms. Men can cry, obviously, but many choose not to or feel they're not allowed to, so they hold it in. Societal pressure is like an invisible hand on their shoulder, squeezing, saying, "Don't you dare cry." And over years, that becomes part of their identity. I'm the guy who doesn't cry. Some even take pride in it, as if it's a testament to their toughness or maturity. But is it really? Or is it just unprocessed fear of appearing vulnerable? It's not only men. Different cultures worldwide have varying crying rules for everyone. In some cultures, public crying is deeply frowned upon for all genders. You might be expected to maintain composure no matter what. In others, crying is seen as a healthy expression and is more accepted. For example, in certain Mediterranean or Middle Eastern cultures, loud wailing at funerals is traditional, often done by women, while in some East Asian cultures, emotional restraint is valued. So people try not to cry openly in sad situations. If a person who never cries comes from a background that extols emotional restraint, their tearlessness could be a culturally learned behavior. They might feel that crying in front of others, especially, would bring shame or at least disapproval. Add to that the layer of context. Maybe they're fine crying in private, but you'll never see them cry in public because that's a no-no in their social script. Some people will say, "It's not that I can't cry, I just can't cry in front of people." These individuals might appear to never cry to their friends, but perhaps they do shed a tear quietly at night, once in a blue moon where no one can see. Still, if someone has learned to equate tears with weakness or failure, they may even suppress the urge alone. It's heartbreaking in a way. They might want to cry, to let it out, but an inner voice goes, "Don't. You're being weak. Stop." That's internalized stigma at work. Let's not forget biology's contribution in the gender realm. We touched on it. Hormones. The primary male hormone, testosterone, actually has a tear-blocking effect. Higher levels of testosterone are associated with the higher threshold for crying, meaning it physiologically takes more for tears to kick in. Meanwhile, the hormone prolactin, which is present in higher levels in females, especially after puberty and even more so after having children, has been theorized to facilitate crying. Some early theories even tried to blame prolactin for women crying more, though the science on that is not completely settled. But we do have evidence that, for instance, when men are given testosterone-suppressing medications, like some prostate cancer treatments, they report crying more easily. And when women take testosterone or anabolic steroids, they sometimes report crying less. So biology dovetails with culture. Society says men shouldn't cry, and conveniently, testosterone makes it a bit easier for them not to by muting the tear response. But don't misinterpret, men still feel the same emotions. It's just slightly less likely to trigger tears. And men absolutely can and do cry. It's just that the bar might be higher. So imagine a man who's been taught from day one that crying is for sissies, and who has a hormonal makeup that makes tears less readily flow. It's not surprising he might reach adulthood, having practically forgotten how to cry at all. Likewise, imagine a woman raised in a family where crying was seen as dramatic or selfish. Even though women generally might cry more, she might buck that trend because she trained herself early on to avoid it. The takeaway here: a person's crying tendencies are often socially sculpted. People who never cry often aren't born that way. They're molded by years of messages and models around them. And these cultural or gender-based expectations become so ingrained that they feel completely natural. The person might say, "I just don't cry, it's just who I am," without realizing how much of that who I am was shaped by what they were taught about tears. Attachment and trauma, when tears get locked away. Let's delve into deeper psychological history. Attachment styles and trauma. Attachment style is basically the blueprint of how you connect and trust others, largely formed in childhood. One particular style stands out for non-criers: the avoidant attachment style. If someone grew up with caregivers who were emotionally unavailable or who discouraged expression of feelings, that child might learn to avoid showing vulnerability. They learn to self-soothe and not expect comfort from others. By adulthood, these folks often become very self-reliant, sometimes uncomfortable with too much emotional closeness. Crying, of course, is one of the most vulnerable things you can do. It literally reveals our inner world to anyone watching, as one psychologist put it. For an avoidantly attached person, that exposure feels scary or simply unnatural. They prefer to process emotions privately or not at all, rather than seek comfort. It's not that they never feel sad or hurt, but you're far less likely to see them cry, because needing that kind of support just isn't in their playbook. Studies have indeed found that people who never or rarely cry often have a more avoidant attachment style, meaning they shy away from depending on others emotionally, and they downplay displays of need like tears. In the same studies, these non-criers also reported less anxiety in their attachments. In other words, they aren't the clingy, worry-about abandonment types, they're the opposite. So they form the image of the strong, independent type who doesn't cry. Trauma, especially in early life, can supercharge this effect. Consider someone who experienced abuse, whether physical or emotional, at a young age. If crying only ever brought them more pain, like an abuser getting angrier when they cried, or a neglectful parent ignoring them when they were in tears, then not crying could literally become a survival strategy. The child learns, when I cry, bad things happen. When I don't cry, I might stay safe. So they train themselves, consciously or not, to never cry. Fast forward to adulthood, and that person might find they cannot cry, even if they want to. The body and mind have set up a kind of protective numbness. It's often seen in PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, survivors, a phenomenon called emotional numbing. After very traumatic experiences, some people report that they feel cut off from emotions that would normally be there. For example, a combat veteran or a survivor of childhood abuse might say they haven't cried in years. They sometimes even wish they could cry to release the pain, but the tears just won't come. Trauma can basically put the emotional system on lockdown. The person survives by not feeling, which of course means not crying. Paradoxically, while many associate PTSD with more emotional outbursts, like flashbacks or panic attacks, a significant subset of trauma survivors experience this flatness. They describe feeling empty or like they're made of stone when it comes to emotions. It's like the volume on their emotional register is turned way down as a protective mechanism. One study even suggests a link between tearlessness and certain psychopathologies. They noted possible connections with things like PTSD and even psychopathic traits. Now, let's be very clear. Having psychopathic traits, like extremely low empathy or shallow affect, is rare and not the case for the vast majority of people who don't cry. But it's true that a psychopath, someone with an emotional impairment that makes them feel very little guilt, fear, or attachment, might almost never cry, except maybe as fake manipulation. That's an extreme end of the spectrum. On the more common end, you have garden variety emotional trauma. People who are neglected or emotionally dismissed may develop a kind of hardened exterior. They might become the friend who's always there to support others, but never shows their own hurt. If you probe, they might admit they hate crying, or don't know how to cry. In therapy sessions, such people often struggle to access sadness. When they finally do and break down crying for the first time in decades, it can be a huge moment of breakthrough. Attachment style from childhood sets the stage. Securely attached, folks usually know it's okay to cry and be comforted, so they might cry more freely. Avoidant attached folks learned, crying doesn't get me comfort, it might even get me scolded, so why cry? They carry that script forever, unless something helps them unlearn it, and trauma can lock that script in place with steel bars. A quick note on grief. Sometimes you'll see a person who just lost a loved one not crying at all. People around them might even whisper, "Why isn't he crying at his wife's funeral? Is he in shock? Did he not love her?" Often, this comes down to either shock. Early in grief, some people feel numb and dissociated, a normal response, or their attachment trauma background with showing emotion. They might deeply mourn internally, but have an ingrained mechanism to stay outwardly composed. It could also be that they feel a need to be strong for others, another learned behavior. Eventually, many of these people do cry, perhaps alone, or days or weeks later when something finally triggers release. But some may never cry, and it doesn't necessarily mean they aren't grieving. Their attachment style might just dictate a different way of processing. For instance, throwing themselves into planning memorial details instead of breaking down crying. The big point here, if someone never cries, it's worth considering what their life story is. Often, a lack of tears has roots in past pain. It might signify scars we don't see. That quiet, dry-eyed person comforting everyone else could be someone who had to grow up fast and become the strong one early in life, so their tears were left behind in childhood. Understanding this can shift our perspective from judgment, "they're so cold," to compassion. "They learned to survive by being tough. I wonder what they went through." It doesn't mean you need to pry, but it's a reminder that tears or no tears, there is always an emotional story underneath. The biology of crying, hardware issues, and why some don't turn on the waterworks. Time to get a bit into the science of crying itself, because part of understanding non-criers is understanding what's supposed to happen when we cry. Crying is a pretty complex physiological process for such a common behavior. Here's the quick rundown. When you experience a strong emotion, say extreme sadness or even extreme joy, your limbic system in the brain, particularly areas like the amygdala and hypothalamus, respond to that emotional surge. If the emotion hits a certain intensity, the brain sends signals down to the brainstem, specifically a region called the pons, which then activates the parasympathetic nervous system. This is the part of your nervous system that often handles rest and digest functions, and interestingly, also triggers the production of tears. Your lacrimal glands, tear glands, get the message. Release the tears, and boom, your eyes fill up and overflow. Along with the tears, other physiological changes happen. You might get that lump in your throat, thanks to a reflex called the glottis closing. Your facial muscles contort. We've all seen an ugly cry face. Your vocal cords might make sobbing sounds, and your breathing pattern shifts. It's like an orchestrated whole-body response. Now, people who never cry, is it possible that their hardware works differently? In some cases, yes. A very small percentage of people might have actual medical reasons for not crying. For example, Sjögren's syndrome or other conditions can cause chronically dry eyes where you physically can't produce tears easily. Certain medications, like some antihistamines, decongestants, or antidepressants, can also dry you out literally, making it hard to cry. If someone says, "I feel sad but my eyes just don't tear up," and especially if this started after a new medication, that might be the culprit. Neurological injuries or diseases can also mess with crying reflexes. For instance, there's something known as pathological crying, or the opposite, an inability to cry, in some people who've had strokes or brain injuries. However, in the context of our discussion, otherwise healthy individuals who just rarely cry, those medical cases are less common, but worth mentioning. Sometimes it's not psychological at all, but biological. For the majority though, it's not that their tear machinery is broken, it's that the signals from the brain are not triggering the machinery due to psychological factors. They might not experience the emotion intensely enough, or they might intercept it with suppression before it triggers the tears. It's like a circuit breaker. The feeling starts to surge, and either it doesn't surge high enough to flip the cry switch, or they trip the breaker manually by cutting off the feeling. Interestingly, scientists still don't fully understand why humans cry emotionally. We're basically the only animals that do this. Your dog may whine or have eye discharge, but it's not weeping from sadness. Some researchers have called emotional crying an evolutionary riddle. One leading theory is that tears serve as a social signal, a non-verbal way to say, "I need help," or "I'm overwhelmed" to others. Tears are literally a social glue mechanism. When we see someone cry, most of us feel a surge of empathy and often respond with comfort. It's a way of eliciting support. And guess what? If you never cry, you might be missing out on that benefit. Non-criers don't broadcast vulnerability in the same way, so they might not get the same level of care or bonding from others in moments of stress. In fact, That study we talked about earlier, comparing non-criers to criers, found exactly that. People who cried normally felt more connected to and supported by their social network, whereas the never cry folks felt less connected and had less support. It's as if by not sending out those help signals, tears, they indeed received less help or empathy from others, leading to a bit of disconnection socially. Now, whether they wanted support or not is another matter. Remember, avoidant types might not seek it anyway, but it's an intriguing consequence of a tearless life. Another biological aspect. As mentioned, crying can be cathartic, but it's not guaranteed. Roughly half of people feel better after crying, and a notable chunk feel the same or worse. A lot depends on the context. Do you get comfort or feel embarrassed? So a person who never cries might say, "See, I don't need to cry. It wouldn't help me anyway." Maybe in their personal history, the few times they did cry, nothing good came of it, no one comforted them, or they felt shame. So their body-brain might have learned crying doesn't solve anything. Biologically, instead of getting a relief boost of endorphins, maybe they mainly felt the unpleasant side. Headache, exhaustion. Everyone's body responds a bit differently to a crying bout. Some of us feel relieved. Some feel drained. If a person happens to be in the latter category, they might unconsciously avoid crying because their body isn't giving them those feel-good rewards for it. And let's be a tad cheeky here. Non-criers might also avoid some annoying parts of crying. The puffy red eyes, the stuffy nose, the blotchy face. Perhaps their vain side doesn't mind skipping that. But jokes aside, the physiological aftermath of crying can be unpleasant for some. Migraine sufferers, for instance, sometimes dread crying because it triggers headaches. So if someone's learned, every time I cry, I get a splitting headache, they might subconsciously hold back tears too. In summary, the biology of crying shows us it's a complex interplay of brain, body, and social signaling. People who never cry may have slight hormonal, neurological tilts that raise their cry threshold. But more importantly, they often have psychological and learned patterns that keep that biological cry switch turned off. Their parasympathetic nervous system might be perfectly capable of making tears, it just doesn't get the green light, or it gets a red light from their conscious mind. They've essentially rewired the reflex through habit and mindset. Numbness, control, or resilience, not all dry eyes are the same. We've hinted at this, but let's lay it out clearly. There's more than one flavor of non-crier. Just because two people never cry doesn't mean it's for the same reason or with the same effects. It really comes down to whether their lack of crying is stemming from emotional numbness, deliberate control, or genuine resilience. These are very different states, though from the outside they all look like no tears. Emotional numbness. This is the person who wants to cry, or thinks they should cry, but can't. Imagine feeling extremely sad or in pain, but there's this wall inside that blocks the release. This often occurs in conditions like depression or PTSD. For instance, many people with major depression describe an odd symptom, not being able to cry at all, even when in deep despair. They feel hollowed out, beyond tears. This numbness is actually quite painful in its own way. Some say it's worse than crying because you want to feel something, to have that emotional catharsis, but you're stuck in dry, dull ache. If someone never cries because they're emotionally numb, that's usually a sign that something is off balance psychologically. It could be a protective mechanism, as with trauma, or a facet of the illness, as with certain types of depression that cause what's called anhedonia, inability to feel pleasure or deep emotion. These individuals might worry, "What's wrong with me? Why can't I cry?" They may even envy people who can sob and feel relief. In therapy, a lot of work might revolve around gently reconnecting them with their feelings in a safe way. When numb people start to thaw and cry, it can be a hugely healing moment. So, non-criers in this category are not necessarily strong in the sense of having it all together. They are often hurting behind a frozenness. No tears on the outside, and not much feeling on the inside either. Just a kind of bleak stalemate. Emotional control. Now think of the person who doesn't cry because in their mind, they don't need to. They experience emotions, but they've got them on lock in a healthy, or at least functional way. They might feel sad, but instead of crying, they take deep breaths and process it internally. It's not that they're numb, they do feel it, but they have high emotional regulation skills. Perhaps they're able to cognitively reframe situations quickly. It's sad, but it's not the end of the world. I can handle this. Or maybe they prefer to express emotion through words or art rather than tears. These people often come off as very composed. Think of a leader who stays calm during a crisis that has everyone else in tears or panic. They could be deeply concerned or heartbroken inside, but they're channeling that emotion into action or into a stoic exterior. Maybe because they feel they have to be the anchor for everyone else. In some cases, this veers into over-control, where they never really let themselves fully experience vulnerability. But in others, it's just their natural temperament combined with coping skills. They might cry very occasionally, like once every few years if something truly overwhelming happens. But in day-to-day hardships, they just don't reach the crying point. One could call this mental toughness, though not in the toxic crying is weakness sense, but in the sense of resilience, which we'll separate out in a second. If it's true control, it usually means they can cry if they wanted to, or if they decided it was beneficial. They're just choosing other methods to deal with the feelings. There's an element of will in it. Resilience. Emotional resilience. By resilience, I mean the ability to bounce back quickly from stress or adversity. A resilient person might not cry simply because they genuinely recover from emotional hits rapidly, or endure them without reaching a breaking point. They might feel sad or mad, but within an hour they've found their equilibrium again. It's a bit like having a strong immune system. The emotional virus doesn't keep them sick for long, so symptoms like crying don't manifest much. Some resilient individuals have an optimistic mindset that protects them. This is tough now, but it will get better, no need to cry over it. Others have a strong support system or healthy coping outlets that prevent emotional overwhelm. Resilience can come from personality, from learned coping strategies, or often from having faced challenges in the past successfully. Important: resilience is not the same as numbness or suppression. The resilient non-crier isn't avoiding or incapable of emotion. They're experiencing it and naturally healing from it quickly. They might tear up in the moment of shock or pain, but soon they're focused on solutions or hope, and the tears just stop or never fully form. You might know people who say, "Yeah, I cried for a minute when I heard the bad news, but then I pulled myself together and got to work on fixing things." Those are resilient types. Some resilient folks indeed hardly ever cry because life's hardships don't keep them down for long. They aren't necessarily better than criers, sometimes crying is part of resilience too. But their style tends to be more about action and adaptation than venting emotion. Now, why lay out these distinctions? Because if you are someone who never cries, or you know someone like this, it's worth reflecting. Is it because I can't feel it? Numb? Is it because I won't let myself suppress, control? Or is it because I genuinely cope fine without tears? Resilience. Each scenario might suggest a different approach. The numb person might need support reconnecting with emotions. The over-control person might need to learn it's okay to let go, and that vulnerability isn't weakness. The resilient person, hey, they're doing okay, as long as they're not secretly avoiding issues. They might just need to remind their tearful friends that I do care even if I'm not crying, because otherwise their empathy might be questioned. From the outside perspective, this is also a call not to judge too quickly. If your friend never cries, it could be any of these reasons. Don't assume they're heartless, they might be traumatized and numb. Don't assume they're 100% fine, they might be dying inside but unable to express it. And conversely, don't assume they're secretly damaged either. They might truly just be a rock-solid, resilient type. Human emotions are complicated, folks. One size definitely does not fit all. Social and relationship implications, when tears, or lack thereof, affect others. So what is it like to live or interact with a person who never cries? There are some real social ripple effects. We hinted that non-criers often feel a bit less connected or supported socially. Part of that is because they're not waving the "I need comfort" flag that tears represent, so people might not offer them as much emotional support. Another part is how others perceive them. Let's be honest, many people find crying to be a sign of empathy, warmth, or emotional openness. So if someone never cries, others might see them as distant or overly stoic. Loved ones might sometimes feel perplexed, or even hurt by a non-crier's reactions. For example, in a romantic relationship, one partner might say, "It bothers me that you didn't cry when I was crying. Do you even care about what I'm going through?" The non-crier might absolutely care, but their face and dry eyes didn't telegraph it in the expected way. This mismatch can cause misunderstandings. The crying person might assume lack of tears equals lack of feeling, which isn't necessarily true, but it's a common inference. There's also the matter of vulnerability and intimacy. When two people cry together or one cries in front of the other, it often deepens trust between them. If you have a friend who's seen you sobbing ugly tears during your worst moments, and they've cried in your arms too, there's a special bond there. A sense that we can be raw and real together. A person who never cries may unintentionally keep a certain wall up in relationships. Their friends or partners might say they feel like, "I never get to see you truly vulnerable." It can limit how close others feel to them, not because the non-crier isn't trying, but just because that particular mode of emotional expression is absent. People might even hesitate to share deeply emotional things with the non-crier, fearing they won't get a sympathetic reaction. In group settings, the non-crier might end up cast in the role of the strong one, or the rational one. That can be a blessing or a curse. On one hand, friends might admire them for being so steady. On the other, they might inadvertently lean on them too much, forgetting that even if they don't cry, they still have feelings and limits. The non-crier could become the go-to support for others, since they're not going to break down. But who supports the non-crier? It can be lonely being the one who never cries. People assume you don't need emotional support, but you do. Just maybe in different ways. In professional or leadership contexts, not crying is often seen as a positive, especially given stereotypes that crying is unprofessional. A leader who stays dry-eyed during layoffs, for instance, might be viewed as admirably composed, or by some, as coldly unemotional. It kind of depends on the audience's values. We generally don't want our surgeons, pilots, or national leaders bursting into tears in a crisis, right? We appreciate their steady hands and calm. So non-criers can thrive in roles that require keeping cool under pressure. The downside is, if they do feel overwhelmed, they might lack outlets or might not get support because everyone assumes you're fine, you always handle it. They might also face stigma if they ever did cry, because it's so out of character that people might overreact. Oh my gosh, if they're crying, it must be really bad. Another social angle, friends and family might sometimes try to make a non-crier cry, out of a strange belief that it would be good for them. You see this trope in movies or interventions. You need to cry, let it out. While well-intentioned, it can backfire. Pressuring someone to cry can make them even more self-conscious about it, reinforcing the block. Everyone has their own timeline for if and when they're ready to cry. Some non-criers may eventually have a moment that breaks the dam, maybe a cumulative buildup of stress or a particularly poignant experience. And when that happens, they could cry buckets. If and when that occurs, they'll need understanding, not "finally you cry, took you long enough." Ideally, their loved ones would be supportive and recognize what a big deal that is for them. It's worth noting too, the inverse situation. Highly emotional people might feel uncomfortable around someone who never cries, as if their own emotional expressions are being judged. If you're sobbing and your friend is just sitting dry-eyed, you might suddenly feel a bit self-aware or even think they're judging you as overdramatic, even if they're not. This can create a small rift, where the crier feels embarrassed and the non-crier feels awkward that they can't mirror the emotion. Communication helps here. Sometimes the non-crier might need to verbalize their empathy since they're not showing it with tears. I want you to know I do feel for you. I just don't tend to cry, but I'm here for you. And the crier might need to trust that statement rather than expecting tears as proof. Socially, there is also a bit of mythologizing around people who don't cry. Some might see them as very strong, the rock everyone can count on. Others might secretly suspect they're repressed or emotionally constipated. The reality can be either or neither. Society loves to put people in boxes, but emotional life defies simple categorization. A person could be incredibly compassionate and yet almost never physically cry. Another could cry at the drop of a hat but be selfish in their actions. We have to look at the whole person. If you're a non-crier, it can help to let those close to you know how you do express or experience care and sadness. Maybe you say, "I know I didn't cry when you told me that news, but I was really upset for you. I tend to show it by wanting to help or just spending time together, rather than crying." Teaching your friends and loved ones your language of caring can bridge the gap. Also, if you've got reasons, like crying was not safe in my house growing up, sharing that with a trusted person can help them understand you better. It's hard for me to cry, I think because of my past, but I do feel it inside. That kind of vulnerability, even without actual tears, can increase emotional intimacy. And if you're someone frustrated by a partner or friend who never cries, consider reframing how you view their strength. Sometimes we equate crying with caring, but pay attention to what they do. Do they listen, hug you, problem solve, sit quietly with you? Those are all ways of being emotionally present that might come more naturally to them than crying. Recognize those gestures as their form of empathy. It might not be the dramatic hallmark moment you expect, but it's no less meaningful in its own way. Rethinking tears, a balanced conclusion. By now, we've seen that the psychology of people who never cry is anything but simple. It's a tapestry woven from threads of personality, upbringing, culture, biology, and life experiences. There's no one-size-fits-all answer. A tearless face could hide fierce emotional control, deep wounds, or a genuinely steady, resilient spirit, or a mix of all of the above. What we can say is that crying, or not crying, isn't a straightforward measure of someone's depth or strength. Crying is normal and human, and so is not crying. Both have their place. Society often glorifies emotional stoicism on one hand. Wow, she never cries, she's so strong, yet also pathologizes it on the other. What's wrong with her that she never cries? The truth lies somewhere in the middle. Not crying doesn't automatically mean someone is strong like a superhero or cold like a psychopath. And crying doesn't automatically mean someone is weak or overly emotional. Think of tears as just one possible outcome of feeling something. Some people laugh when they're nervous. Some people get quiet when they're angry. Some people cry when they're happy. Humans are weird and wonderful in the variety of how we express emotion. So if you rarely cry, cut yourself some slack. It might just be how you're built, or a habit that served you at one time. You're not broken for having dry eyes, but also check in with yourself. Make sure those dry eyes aren't because you're forcing them to be dry out of fear or shame. If that's the case, you might consider giving yourself permission to cry when you need to. It can be healing, and it doesn't make you any less strong. In fact, sometimes it takes courage to let those tears fall, especially when you've been taught not to. On the flip side, if you're a frequent crier and you encounter a non-crier, try not to assume the worst. They might have an internal emotional life that just doesn't spill outwards, the same way yours does. They might be the calm in the storm, processing things quietly. And if you are close to them and worry they're bottling up, maybe have a gentle conversation. I notice you never cry. Do you feel like you don't need to? Or do you feel like you can't? I'm here if you ever want to talk about it. This gives them space to reflect without judgment. They may open up about their past or simply reassure you that they're okay. One last interesting thought. Sometimes people's relationship with crying changes over time. A person who never cried in their 20s might find in their 50s that they tear up more often. Perhaps life taught them it's okay, or hormones shifted, or they just grew more comfortable in their skin. The opposite can happen too. So these things aren't set in stone. Emotional habits can evolve. In conclusion, whether you're team no tears or a proud crybaby, remember that what truly matters is emotional authenticity and health. Are you dealing with your feelings in a way that's true and constructive for you? For some, that means having a good cry. For others, it means quiet reflection or discussing feelings rather than weeping. We all traverse the landscape of human emotions differently, and that's okay. The world would be pretty boring if everyone reacted the same way to everything, wouldn't it? So the next time you encounter someone who just never seems to cry, resist the urge to call them heartless or assume they're superhuman. Instead, you might think, there's more to their story. And if you're the non-crier in the room, know that crying or not crying doesn't define how deeply you feel or care. Only you, and perhaps a good therapist, truly know what's behind those dry eyes. Stay empathetic, stay curious, and take care of your own emotional well-being. Tears or no tears. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the human psyche, please give it a thumbs up. Whether you're someone who cries at puppy commercials, or someone who hasn't shed a tear in years, I'd love to hear your thoughts. What's your take on crying? Did anything here surprise you? Let's discuss in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more psychology topics that will make you reflect, learn, and maybe even shed a tear or two. Or not. No pressure. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.